Thank you so much, Zayed. And what a party. This must be the first Christmas party Boris hasn't attended. Really a hard task you've given me to follow Max and the Bobcats, I have to say. But what a pleasure to be back speaking to you in person. Because for the last 2 years I've been doing it on Zoom. I've got so fed up doing about 3 or 4 Zooms every week that I was beginning to think human beings were two-dimensional. Now, seeing all my friends in the ILA in person, it's a great privilege for me to be back here. And it's a great privilege and pleasure for me to thank you for all the really vital, the essential work that you all do in raising the cause of human rights abuse, violations against humanity that take place in Iran and in the Middle East. So I want to strike a more serious note this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to update you today on the situation in Iran. You will no doubt have heard that tens of thousands of impoverished farmers have been taken to the streets day after day for the past month in the central Iranian city of Isfahan to protest about water shortages, because in a mass uprising the farmers pointed to the Zayand-e-Rud river, which flows through the center of the city and is now a dried up basin, cracked, sun-baked mud. And the farmers have been chanting slogans such as, "Raisi, this is your last warning," courageously challenging their new repressive President Ebrahim Raisi, who's known as the Butcher of Tehran for his leading role in the 1988 massacre of over 30,000 political prisoners. A group of these protesting farmers have even staged a sit-in in the dried-up Zayand-e-Rud riverbed, where they've set up a special camp. The Zayand-e River has been allowed to dry up due to the recurrent diversion of water by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, which is the equivalent of the regime's Gestapo. They control more than 75% of the economy of Iran. The farmers claim that the IRGC have constructed tunnels and canals to divert the river to neighboring Yazd province, where they have corruptly plundered the profits from a series of heavily industrial, water-guzzling military factories. And now similar water protests have taken place in Shari-Khord, the capital of Charama Mahal and Bakhtiari province. Now, these protests have taken place against a background of the usual threats and violence from the repressive theocratic regime. The farmers were violently attacked with batons, with tear gas, and the IRGC even opened fire on them with shotguns. And many of the farmers, many of the protesters were hit in the face with shotgun pellets and blinded in both eyes or in one eye. And now protests taking place across the whole of Iran. Protesters are wearing patches over one eye to show solidarity and sympathy with their wounded compatriots. Now, following these deadly riots that broke out way back in July in the southwestern province of Khuzestan, after drought there led to widespread water shortages, the mullahs have begun to panic. Raisi promised to resolve the water crisis, stating that he would form a working group tasked with rehabilitating the Zayende River, which of course is now impossible. But meanwhile, fearing that support for the farmers' protests would spread nationwide, the mullahs cut off the internet and tried to suppress information about the uprising. The protesting farmers in Isfahan say that the water crisis is so calamitous that they've been unable to plant crops for several seasons. They can no longer grow wheat to make bread, a staple food in Iran. And with 75% of the 80 million Iranian population now struggling to survive on daily incomes below the international poverty line, protests against the mullahs have grown in size and ferocity. On top of the water crisis, the people are now suffering from high unemployment, rampaging inflation, spiraling prices, disintegrating living conditions, and a collapsing economy. And teachers across the whole of Iran have now taken to the streets in protest. And would you believe the coronavirus pandemic, which has been so incompetently handled by the mullahs, has now taken the lives of an estimated 488,000 people dead from the COVID disease. But the repressive regime's warmongering, their rank incompetence, their venal corruption and voracious profiteering have increased the risk and the incidence of natural environmental disasters in Iran. The devastating floods, the raging forest fires, toxic air pollution, uncontrolled desertification, grave water shortages, they've all pushed the Iranian environment to the edge of destruction. And it was against that background that I was alarmed back in Scotland when I heard the news that Ebrahim Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, was intending, as Zayed told you, to travel to Glasgow in November to attend the COP26 UN Climate Change Summit. So together with Hossein Abedini and Tahar Bamedra, who many of you may know, we lodged a huge dossier of evidence with both the Metropolitan Police and the Glasgow Police, calling for Raisi's arrest for crimes against humanity and genocide. We held a big press conference in Glasgow, and the news went viral, particularly around the Middle East. Scotland's biggest selling Sunday newspaper, the Sunday Mail, carried a front page banner headline, "Arrest the Butcher," and a huge two-page spread inside. And they carried quotes from some of the survivors and relatives of the 1988 massacre of political prisoners. Because, you know, in his role as public prosecutor, Raisi often supervised the torture of men and women and then witnessed their hanging. He was head of the judiciary when orders were given to shoot dead protesters during the nationwide uprising that took place in November 2019, when over 1,500 mostly young protesters were killed and thousands more were injured. And the injured were dragged from their hospital beds by the IRGC, and many were taken away, tortured, and subsequently executed in Iran's prisons. So when Ebrahim Raisi heard that the police in Scotland were actively assessing this very large dossier of evidence against him, he chickened out and he quickly cancelled his plans to come to Glasgow. Well, it was a huge victory for us. Raisi was looking forward to rubbing shoulders with other leading human rights abusers like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. But he could have faced arrest under universal jurisdiction, which enables a state to claim criminal jurisdiction over an accused person, regardless of where the alleged crime was committed and regardless of the accused's nationality. His pariah status will now make international travel increasingly difficult for Raisi, particularly if he dares to set foot in the West. In his report to the UN General Assembly this summer, Professor Javed Rahman, who is a top human rights QC from London, and is now the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, raised concerns regarding the destruction of evidence and of the extrajudicial executions that took place in 1988, the massacre of political prisoners. In August this year, the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, in a report to the UN Human Rights Council, called for an international investigation into the 1988 massacre, stating that the working group reiterates the concerns expressed about the ongoing concealment of burial sites across the country. And now Agnes Callamard, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, has called for Raisi to be investigated for crimes against humanity and for his involvement in murder, enforced disappearance, and torture. Right now, some of you may be aware that in Sweden, the trial of Hamid Nouri is continuing. He was one of Raisi's functionaries who actively participated in the 1988 hangings. And plaintiffs have told the Stockholm court how Raisi would happily munch on cakes and pastries while sentencing dozens of men, even pregnant women, and often teenagers, to death after arbitrary 2-minute trials. Well, Hamid Nouri made the big mistake of thinking that he could go for a holiday to Sweden, and under universal jurisdiction, he is now on trial. And in Belgium, we're waiting the judgment on the Court of Appeal from 3 of the terrorist bombers who joined Assadollah Assadi, the so-called Iranian diplomat, a registered Iranian diplomat, who brought a bomb professionally manufactured in Iran in his diplomatic pouch on a commercial airline flying from Tehran to Vienna, and then handed it over to 3 co-conspirators who are now appealing their sentence, and sent them to detonate the bomb in the 2018 huge National Council of Resistance of Iran rally attended by over 100,000 people near Paris. Some of you may have been there. I was there myself and was indeed a plaintiff at the trial. So the theocratic regime, ladies and gentlemen, is in trouble. It's facing justice in several EU courts. It's struggling to survive the collapse of the Iranian economy and the rampaging coronavirus pandemic. It's desperately seeking for ways to continue financing its proxy wars in Syria, in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, while at the same time attempting to boost its supply of uranium to weapons-grade status. This is a zombie regime led by a psychotic supreme leader and a criminal murderer as president. There is no way the US, the EU, or the UN should contemplate any attempt at lifting sanctions and restoring the failed nuclear deal To do so would be a gross act of appeasement and a naked betrayal of the Iranian people. There's only one way. Thank you. There is only one way to resolve all of the environmental, all of the social, all of the security problems that beset Iran and its neighbors. And that is by backing the Iranian people and helping them to remove this evil regime and replace it with a secular democracy. Now, please let me end by thanking you once again sincerely for your great support for the ILA and for the work that you do in exposing and countering human rights abuse in Iran and the wider Middle East. You know, the ILA has played a decisive role in furthering this cause. The satellite transmission it supports into Iran and beyond is undoubtedly one of the most effective ways to break the wall of censorship and to shed light on the regime's crimes. The success the ILA has achieved over the last 5 to 6 years in saving the lives of hundreds of prisoners of conscience, and the vital role you played in taking 3,000 Iranian refugees out of harm's way has really been inspiring. So I think we have a lot of reasons to be hopeful for the future. And I think it would be absolutely appropriate, ladies and gentlemen, for the work that you do, that you give yourselves a great round of applause. Thank you. Thanks, Juliet.